There is a moment in every war when the oppressed decide they would rather die standing than live on their knees. For Scotland, that moment came on a narrow wooden bridge over the River Forth on the morning of September 11th, 1297. What happened there was not simply a battle, it was a reckoning, a blood-soaked declaration written in steel and flesh that would echo through the centuries. The history books tell you William Wallace won a great victory that day. What they don't tell you is how savage, how brutal, and how absolutely terrifying that victory truly was. Picture, if you will, the mist rising from the river at dawn, the cold Scottish air biting at the faces of men who knew they might not see the sunset. On one side, the most powerful army in Europe, English knights in gleaming armor, professional soldiers, archers whose arrows could blot out the sun. On the other, a ragtag collection of farmers, blacksmiths and fishermen, led by a man whose name would become synonymous with freedom itself. The odds were impossible. The English knew it. The Scots knew it. And yet, by the time the sun set that day, the River Forth would run red with English blood, and a tax collector's skin would hang from a Scottish sword. This is not the story you learned in school. This is not the sanitized version of history designed to make you comfortable. This is the true story of Stirling Bridge, a story of patience, of cunning, of rage, and of a brutality so extreme that it shocked even the medieval world, a world already intimately acquainted with violence. This is the story of how a nation found its voice in the screams of its enemies and wrote its Declaration of Independence in blood. To understand what happened at Stirling Bridge, we must first understand the Scotland of 1297. This was a nation in chains, a proud people brought low by conquest and humiliation. Just 1 year earlier, King Edward I of England, a man history would remember as Longshanks and the Hammer of the Scots, had systematically dismantled Scottish sovereignty. He had invaded, he had conquered, and he had stripped the nation of its very identity. The stone of Scone, upon which Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries, had been carted off to Westminster. Scottish nobles had been forced to sign the Ragman Rolls, pledging their allegiance to the English crown. Scotland, in the eyes of London, had ceased to exist as an independent nation. But conquest is one thing, occupation is another. Edward left behind a network of English administrators, tax collectors, and garrisons to squeeze every last penny from the Scottish people. Among these administrators was a man named Hugh de Cressingham, the Treasurer of Scotland, a tax collector of legendary greed and cruelty. Contemporary accounts describe him as immensely fat, arrogant, and utterly contemptuous of the people he was tasked with exploiting. He raised taxes to crushing levels, demanded payment in coin when most Scots had only livestock, and showed no mercy to those who could not pay. If Edward VI was the hammer, Cressingham was the grinding stone, wearing away at the Scottish spirit day by day. The English believed they had won. They believed Scotland was broken. They were catastrophically wrong. In the hills and forests, in the small villages and isolated farmsteads, resistance was growing. Men were sharpening their spears, nursing their grievances, and waiting for a leader. That leader emerged from the most unlikely of places, not from the great noble houses, not from the wealthy landowners, but from the minor gentry. His name was William Wallace, and almost everything about his early life remains shrouded in mystery. What we know is this: Wallace was tall, extraordinarily tall for his time, perhaps 6 feet 5 inches or more. He was strong, skilled with weapons, and possessed of an absolutely implacable hatred for the English occupation. The chronicles tell us that his hatred was personal. One account suggests that English soldiers killed his father. Another claims they murdered his wife or lover, a woman named Marion Braidfute. Whether these stories are true or later embellishments, the result was the same. William Wallace was not interested in negotiation, compromise, or accommodation. He wanted the English gone, and he was willing to wade through rivers of blood to make it happen. In May of 1297, Wallace announced his presence to the world in spectacular fashion. He led an attack on Lanark, the seat of English power in southern Scotland, and personally killed the English sheriff, William de Heselrigge. According to tradition, Wallace cut Heselrigge's body into pieces. This was not mindless violence. It was a message, a declaration, and a recruiting poster all in one. Word spread like wildfire through Scotland. There was a man who was fighting back, a man who was not afraid, a man who was winning. Young men flocked to his banner. The rebellion had begun. Far to the north, another leader was rising. Andrew Moray, unlike Wallace, came from genuine nobility. His family held lands in Moray and had significant wealth and influence. But Moray shared Wallace's burning hatred of the occupation. He had been captured by the English after the conquest, held prisoner at Chester, and had escaped to return to Scotland and raise his own rebellion. Where Wallace operated in the south, Moray raised the north, and by the summer of 1297, English control over Scotland was crumbling everywhere except the southeast, where the main English garrisons remained. The English response was slow, fatally slow. King Edward the Fine was in France, dealing with his continental possessions, and the administration of Scotland was left to John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey. Warenne was an old man, perhaps in his late 60s, and he was tired. He had served Edward faithfully for decades, had fought in Wales, had helped conquer Scotland the previous year, and now he just wanted to retire to his estates in England. The Scottish climate disagreed with him. The Scottish situation disagreed with him more. He spent most of his time across the border, leaving the actual governance to subordinates. By August of 1297, it was clear that something had to be done. Wallace and Moray had joined forces and were moving south, their combined army growing larger by the day. Reports reaching the English command were alarming. Thousands of Scots were under arms, moving with discipline and purpose, threatening to cut off English garrisons and potentially drive the occupation forces out of Scotland entirely. Warenne was finally forced to act. He gathered his army and moved north to crush the rebellion once and for all. The English army that marched towards Stirling in early September was formidable by any standard. Chronicles of the time give varying numbers, but modern historians estimate somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 men, a massive force by medieval standards. Among them were perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 heavy cavalry, the armored knights who were the tanks of medieval warfare. Their horses were bred for size and power, and the knights themselves were encased in chainmail and plate armor, wielding lances, swords, and maces. In a conventional battle on open ground, heavy cavalry was virtually unstoppable. They could smash through infantry formations, pursue fleeing enemies, and dominate any battlefield. Supporting the cavalry were thousands of infantry, Welsh longbowmen whose arrows could pierce armor at 200 yards. English men-at-arms trained in close combat, and various levies and militia. This was a professional army, well-equipped, well-supplied, and confident in its superiority. They had crushed Scottish armies before. They expected to do so again. The Scots, after all, were just peasants, farmers and shepherds who had picked up spears and thought they could stand against the might of England. The Scottish army that awaited them near Stirling was indeed smaller, perhaps 6,000 men, though numbers from this period are notoriously unreliable. What they lacked in numbers and equipment, they made up for in something the English consistently underestimated: motivation. These were men fighting for their homes, their families, their freedom. Many had lost relatives to English brutality. Many had been driven from their lands by English taxation. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. And they were led by two men, Wallace and Moray, who were tactical geniuses. The Scottish army was also not the disorganized rabble the English assumed. Wallace and Moray had imposed discipline, had trained their men in formation fighting, and had developed tactics specifically designed to neutralize the English advantages. The centerpiece of Scottish tactics was the schiltron, a dense circular or rectangular formation of men bristling with 12-foot spears. When properly formed, a schiltron was like a giant hedgehog. Any cavalry charge would impale itself on hundreds of spear points before it could reach the men inside. The schiltron was not new. Similar formations had been used throughout Europe, but Wallace and Moray drilled their men until they could form, hold, and maneuver these formations with deadly precision. The two armies came within sight of each other on September 10, 1297. The English had reached the south bank of the River Forth, near Stirling Castle, the strategic key to Scotland. Whoever controlled Stirling controlled the main route between the Scottish Highlands and the Lowlands. The River Forth was wide and deep at this point, with extensive boggy ground on both banks. There was only one crossing point, a narrow wooden bridge that could accommodate perhaps 2 horsemen riding side by side. For the entire English army to cross would take hours. Warenne, the English commander, was faced with a dilemma. He could not simply ignore the Scottish army on the other side of the river. They would harass his supply lines, cut off his communications, and potentially trap him in hostile territory. But crossing the bridge in the face of an enemy army was incredibly dangerous. Military doctrine of the time, military doctrine of any time, warns against crossing a river in the presence of a hostile force. The army is vulnerable during the crossing, divided by the water, unable to support itself. It was a textbook recipe for disaster. There was an alternative. About 2 miles upstream, there was a ford where 60 horsemen could cross abreast. The English could have sent their cavalry across at the ford, swept around the Scottish flank, and caught Wallace's army between 2 forces. This was the sensible option. This was what any competent commander would have done. 2 Scottish nobles who had defected to the English side, Sir Richard Lundy, explicitly recommended this course of action. He offered to lead the flanking force himself, promising to take the Scots from behind and deliver a crushing victory. Warenne seemed inclined to accept this advice, but Cressingham objected. The fat treasurer was not a military man, but he was responsible for the finances of the campaign, and he was deeply concerned about the cost. Every day, the army remained in the field, cost money. Money for food, money for fodder, money for wages. Cressingham wanted a quick, cheap victory. He argued against the flanking maneuver, insisting that the army should cross the bridge directly and finish the Scots quickly. "There is no point in drawing out this business any further," he reportedly said, "or in wasting the king's money on useless maneuvers." It was perhaps the most expensive cost-cutting measure in military history. Warenne, tired and perhaps not thinking clearly, deferred to Cressingham. The army would cross the bridge. The decision was made, and with that decision, Warenne signed the death warrants of thousands of his own men. The English began their crossing on the morning of September 11th. The process was agonizingly slow. The bridge was narrow, the army was large, and on the far side there was limited space to deploy because of the boggy ground along the river's edge. The crossing would take most of the day if uninterrupted. Wallace watched from the high ground north of the river. He had positioned his army on Abbey Craig, a rocky hill that gave him a commanding view of the bridge and the loop of the river below. The River Forth curved dramatically at this point, creating a natural trap. Anyone crossing the bridge would find themselves in a peninsula of land, with the river curving around 3 sides. There was only one way in and one way out. The bridge itself. Wallace waited. He watched the English vanguard cross, the first 100 men, then the first 1,000. He did not move. The English were puzzled by the Scottish inactivity. Some began to grow confident. Perhaps the Scots were afraid. Perhaps they would flee without fighting. The English kept crossing. More and more men crowded onto the northern bank, their formations growing disordered as they tried to deploy on the limited ground available. Still, Wallace waited. He was counting, calculating, waiting for exactly the right moment. The moment when enough English had crossed to represent a significant victory if destroyed, but not so many that they could hold their ground. The moment when the trap was perfectly set. The morning wore on. The sun climbed higher. The English continued their slow procession across the narrow bridge, 2 by 2, like animals entering Noah's Ark, though for many this bridge would lead not to salvation, but to slaughter. Contemporary accounts suggest that perhaps 5,000 English soldiers had made it across by mid-morning, including a significant portion of the heavy cavalry. They were packed into the loop of the river, a roughly triangular piece of ground, perhaps 400 yards at its widest point. Behind them, the bridge continued to disgorge more men. Ahead of them, the Scottish army remained motionless on the high ground. Wallace had given command of the bridge assault to a man whose name history has preserved only as a certain man of the Earl of Lennox. This unnamed warrior had a crucial mission. At Wallace's signal, he was to lead a force down from the hill and seize the northern end of the bridge, cutting off any retreat and preventing any reinforcements from crossing. The timing had to be perfect. Strike too early, and not enough English would have crossed to make the victory decisive. Strike too late, and the English numbers might become overwhelming. Then came the signal. Wallace raised his horn to his lips and blew. The sound echoed across the river valley, and the Scottish army erupted into motion. Thousands of men came pouring down from Abbey Craig, screaming war cries, their spears levelled. The ground shook with the pounding of their feet. The English on the north bank looked up in horror as a wave of steel-tipped death descended upon them. There was no time to form proper battle lines, no time to organize a coherent defense. The Scots struck like a thunderbolt. The first objective was the bridge. The Scottish force detailed for this mission sprinted down the hill and crashed into the English troops still crossing or just reaching the north bank. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, men hacking and stabbing at close quarters. Within minutes, the Scots had secured the bridgehead. The English on the north bank were now completely cut off. No retreat, no reinforcement, no escape. The trap had sprung shut. On the main battlefield, the Chilterns moved forward with terrible purpose. The Scottish formations, dense blocks of men bristling with 12-foot spears, advanced in disciplined order, their spear points forming an impenetrable wall of steel. The English cavalry attempted to charge, as they had done so successfully in so many previous battles. They spurred their great war horses forward, lances couched, expecting to smash through the Scottish rabble as they had always done. They were wrong. The first wave of English knights met the Chilterns and died. Horses impaled themselves on the forest of spears, screaming and throwing their riders. Knights in heavy armor fell to the ground and were immediately set upon by Scottish infantry, stabbed through the gaps in their armor or simply bludgeoned to death. Those horses that survived the initial impact reared and refused to advance further. No amount of spurring could force them into that wall of spear points. The vaunted English heavy cavalry, the decisive weapon of medieval warfare, was rendered completely ineffective. The English infantry fared no better. Pressed forward by the mass of men behind them, unable to retreat because of the river at their backs, they met the Scottish Chilterns head-on. The Scots pushed forward relentlessly, their long spears giving them the advantage of reach, their dense formations making them virtually impervious to counterattack. English soldiers fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The ground became slick with blood. Men stumbled over the bodies of the fallen, only to be speared themselves. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. Those English soldiers who tried to flee found there was nowhere to go. Behind them was the River Forth, its waters cold and deep. To the sides, the loop of the river cut off any escape. The only way out was the bridge, and the bridge was held by the Scots. Some men tried to swim the river in their armor. They sank like stones, dragged down by 60 pounds of chainmail and drowned in the muddy waters. Others threw off their armor and tried to swim in their undergarments. Many of these drowned too, pulled under by the current or simply exhausted by the desperate attempt. The slaughter continued for what must have seemed an eternity to those trapped in the killing ground. Wave after wave of English soldiers were cut down, pushed into the river, or simply crushed by the press of bodies. The Scottish spearmen showed no mercy. These were men who had suffered years of occupation, years of exploitation, years of humiliation. Every thrust of their spears was payback for a burned village, a stolen cow, a murdered relative. The rage that had been building since Edward's conquest found its outlet in the most brutal way imaginable. On the south bank of the river, the Earl of Surrey and the remainder of the English army watched in horror as their comrades were slaughtered. Surrey ordered the bridge destroyed to prevent the Scots from crossing and attacking his remaining forces, an act that condemned any surviving English on the north bank to death or capture. The wooden structure was pulled down or burned, leaving the trapped English with no hope whatsoever of escape. It was an act of desperate self-preservation, but it meant abandoning thousands of men to their fate. The battle, if it can be called that, lasted perhaps an hour. When it was over, the north bank of the River Forth was carpeted with English dead. Estimates of English casualties vary widely, but modern historians suggest that at least 5,000 English soldiers died at Stirling Bridge, possibly more. Among the dead were many knights and nobles, men whose ransom would normally have made them valuable prisoners of war. The Scots took few prisoners. This was not a battle for profit or political advantage. This was a battle for survival, and the Scots made sure their enemies would never threaten them again. The Scottish casualties were remarkably light, perhaps a few hundred killed and wounded. The tactical brilliance of Wallace and Moray had achieved what seemed impossible: the complete destruction of an English army with minimal loss to their own forces. It was one of the most lopsided victories in medieval military history. A triumph of brains over brawn, of motivation over equipment, of patience over arrogance. But one death in particular would define Stirling Bridge in the popular imagination and would send a message of such savage intensity that it would echo through the centuries. Hugh de Cressingham, the hated tax collector, the man whose greed had pushed Warenne into the disastrous bridge crossing, was dead. He had been in the vanguard, eager perhaps to claim credit for the quick victory he had promised. He found something very different. How exactly Cressingham died is not recorded. Perhaps he fell in the initial Scottish charge, cut down by a farmer's spear. Perhaps he drowned trying to flee across the river, his massive body unable to stay afloat. Perhaps he was captured and executed. What we know is what happened after. The Scots found his body among the piles of dead, recognized it by his fine clothing and enormous girth, and proceeded to express their feelings about English taxation in the most visceral way possible. What the Scots did to Hugh de Cressingham's corpse shocked even the medieval world, a world intimately acquainted with violence, public execution, and the brutal realities of warfare. They flayed him. They cut the skin from his fat body in strips and distributed it among the army as souvenirs of victory. According to multiple contemporary and near-contemporary sources, William Wallace himself had a portion of Cressingham's skin made into a baldric, a belt worn across the chest to carry a sword. This was not random savagery. It was deliberate, calculated, and profoundly symbolic. In medieval Europe, flaying was the punishment reserved for traitors and tax collectors, for those who had violated the basic social contract between ruler and ruled. Cressingham had taxed the Scottish people to the point of starvation. He had shown no mercy to those who could not pay. Now, in death, he would pay with the very skin from his body. The message could not have been clearer. This is what happens to those who exploit Scotland. This is the price of tyranny. The psychological impact of this act on both the Scots and the English cannot be overstated. For the Scottish soldiers who participated or witnessed, it was cathartic, a release of years of pent-up rage and humiliation. The man who had starved their families, who had seized their livestock, who had made their lives a misery, was now reduced to scraps of leather. The power dynamic had been completely reversed. For the English, it was terrifying. This was not the behavior of civilized adversaries who could be negotiated with, bought off, or intimidated. These were men who would literally skin you alive, or at least dead, if you crossed them. The aftermath of Stirling Bridge saw English power in Scotland collapse almost completely. The Earl of Surrey fled south with the remnants of his army, abandoning garrisons, supplies, and any pretense of controlling the country. Within weeks, Wallace and Moray were in effective control of most of Scotland. English administrators, tax collectors, and soldiers evacuated en masse, fearing that they would share Cressingham's fate. The occupation that had seemed so secure just months earlier had disintegrated entirely. Wallace was knighted for his victory and proclaimed Guardian of Scotland, effectively the regent ruling in the name of the absent King John Balliol. He was now the most powerful man in Scotland, a commoner who had risen to lead a nation through sheer force of will and military genius. But the victory came at a cost. Andrew Moray, his co-commander and the man who had raised the North, had been mortally wounded in the battle. He lingered for several weeks before dying of his injuries, depriving Scotland of one of its finest leaders just when he was needed most. Wallace used his new authority to attempt something unprecedented. He invaded England. In late 1297 and early 1298, Scottish armies crossed the border and ravaged the northern English counties with the same ferocity that English armies had visited upon Scotland. They burned, pillaged, and killed, leaving a trail of destruction through Northumberland and Cumberland. It was not primarily a military campaign. Wallace lacked the resources to conquer and hold English territory. It was a punitive expedition, designed to show the English that Scotland could strike back, that the price of aggression would be paid in kind. The news of Stirling Bridge reached King Edward the Fun in Flanders, where he was campaigning against the French. By all accounts, he was furious, not just at the defeat but at the manner of it. That his army had been destroyed by peasants, that his administrator had been skinned like a pig, that his conquered province had risen in rebellion and driven out his forces. All of this was an intolerable insult to his pride and his power. Edward abandoned his French campaign and returned to England, determined to crush the Scottish rebellion personally. Edward was not the Earl of Surrey. He was not tired. He was not indecisive, and he was not inclined to delegate to subordinates. He was perhaps the finest military commander in Europe, a veteran of decades of warfare, a man who had conquered Wales through a combination of military brilliance and systematic brutality. He understood how Wallace had won at Stirling Bridge, and he was determined that it would never happen again. He spent the winter of 1297 to 1298 assembling the largest army England had ever sent against Scotland, perhaps 15,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, along with a formidable force of Welsh longbowmen. The campaign of 1298 was methodical and relentless. Edward advanced into Scotland, systematically reducing castles and fortifications, establishing supply lines, and refusing to be drawn into the kind of tactical trap that had destroyed Warenne's army. Wallace, for his part, adopted a scorched earth strategy, withdrawing before the English advance, burning crops and driving away livestock to deny the invaders food and fodder. For weeks, the two armies maneuvered without coming to battle, the English growing increasingly hungry and frustrated, the Scots waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment never came, or rather, it came on terms very different from Stirling Bridge. In July 1298, Edward's scouts located the Scottish army near Falkirk, deployed in their familiar Chiltern formations. But this time, there was no river to trap the English, no narrow bridge to serve as a killing ground. The battlefield was open moorland, perfect terrain for the English cavalry and archers. Wallace knew the odds were against him, but he could not simply retreat indefinitely. His army would melt away, his political support would evaporate, and everything he had won at Stirling Bridge would be lost. The Battle of Falkirk was the mirror image of Stirling Bridge. Wallace deployed his Chilterns defensively, hoping to repeat the tactic that had destroyed the English cavalry the year before. But Edward was too smart to simply charge into the spear points. Instead, he sent forward his Welsh longbowmen, who poured volley after volley into the packed Scottish formations. The Scots had no answer to this. Their Chilterns were designed to stop cavalry, not arrows. Men began to fall, gaps began to appear in the formations, and still the arrows kept coming. When the schiltrons had been sufficiently weakened, Edward sent in his cavalry. This time the charges broke through. The Scottish formations shattered, and what followed was a rout. Thousands of Scots were cut down as they fled, pursued by English horsemen across the moorland. The army that had triumphed at Stirling Bridge was destroyed at Falkirk, and with it, Wallace's military reputation and political authority. Wallace survived the battle. How? No one knows for certain. Perhaps he fought his way out. Perhaps he fled early when he saw the battle was lost. Perhaps, as some accounts suggest, he was betrayed by Scottish nobles who were jealous of his power and resented being led by a commoner. Whatever the truth, Wallace escaped from Falkirk, but his power was broken. He resigned as Guardian of Scotland, replaced by nobles who were more acceptable to the Scottish establishment. For the next 7 years, Wallace remained at large, a hunted man moving through the shadows of Scottish resistance. He travelled to France, seeking aid from Philip IV, and possibly to Rome, attempting to gain papal support for Scotland's cause. He continued to raid English positions in Scotland when opportunity arose, never giving up the fight, never accepting English rule. But he was no longer the great leader he had been. He was a fugitive, a symbol perhaps, but no longer a power in the land. The English hunted him relentlessly. Edward I had put a price on Wallace's head and demanded his capture as a condition of any peace settlement with the Scots. English spies and Scottish collaborators searched for him throughout the country. In August 1305, their persistence was finally rewarded. Wallace was captured near Glasgow, betrayed, according to tradition, by a Scottish knight named Sir John de Menteith. The exact circumstances of his capture remain murky, but the result was clear. William Wallace, the hero of Stirling Bridge, was in English hands. What followed was not a trial in any meaningful sense. Wallace was taken to London and subjected to a show trial at Westminster Hall, charged with treason against King Edward. Wallace reportedly rejected the charge, pointing out that he had never sworn allegiance to Edward and therefore could not be a traitor. The argument, legally sound as it may have been, made no difference. The verdict was predetermined, and the sentence was the most terrible that medieval law could devise. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace was executed in the manner reserved for traitors, hanged, drawn, and quartered. He was dragged through the streets of London behind a horse, hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still alive. His entrails were cut out and burned before his eyes. He was then beheaded, and his body was cut into 4 quarters. His head was dipped in tar and placed on a spike on London Bridge, where it would remain for years as a warning to other would-be rebels. His quarters were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth, displayed publicly as a reminder of the fate that awaited those who defied English rule. Edward V believed that with Wallace's death, Scottish resistance would finally end. He was wrong. Wallace became more powerful in death than he had ever been in life. A martyr, a symbol, a rallying cry for generations of Scots who would continue the fight for independence. Within 2 years of Wallace's execution, Robert the Bruce would raise the standard of rebellion and begin the campaign that would ultimately lead to Scottish independence at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. The story of Stirling Bridge resonates through the centuries because it speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit: the refusal to submit, the willingness to fight against impossible odds, the capacity of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things when pushed to their breaking point. The farmers and fishermen who charged down Abbey Craig that September morning did not know they were making history. They knew only that they had been oppressed, exploited and humiliated, and that they had finally found leaders willing to fight back. William Wallace was not the noble hero of Hollywood legend. He was a violent man in a violent age, capable of acts like the flaying of Cressingham that shock modern sensibilities. But he was also something more, a man who refused to accept that birth determined worth, that wealth conferred right, that military superiority guaranteed victory. He proved that courage, tactical intelligence, and the willingness to fight could overcome any material disadvantage. He gave Scotland its voice, even if that voice was a war cry. The tactics employed at Stirling Bridge would influence military thinking for centuries. The demonstration that disciplined infantry could defeat heavy cavalry, something that most military theorists of the time thought impossible, pointed the way toward the future of warfare. The Swiss would refine the pike tactics that Wallace employed, creating the most feared infantry in Europe. The English themselves would learn the lesson and develop the combination of longbows and dismounted men-at-arms that would devastate French chivalry at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. But perhaps the most important legacy of Stirling Bridge was psychological rather than tactical. It proved that empires are not invincible, that occupation can be resisted, that the mighty can fall. The image of the English army trapped in the loop of the river, cut to pieces by men they had dismissed as peasants, became a powerful symbol of resistance throughout the British Isles and beyond. When later generations fought against oppression, in Ireland, in America, in India, they drew inspiration from the same wellspring of courage that Wallace had tapped. The physical traces of the battle have largely vanished. The wooden bridge that gave the engagement its name was replaced centuries ago by a stone structure, itself now an ancient monument. The loop of the river has silted up somewhat, changing the geography of the battlefield. Abbey Craig, where Wallace watched and waited, is now crowned by a massive Victorian monument, the Wallace Monument, completed in 1869, a 220-foot tower that dominates the landscape for miles around. Inside, visitors can see a sword reputed to be Wallace's own, a massive 5-foot blade that speaks to the physical power of the man who wielded it. The monument, like so much of Wallace's legacy, is part history and part myth, part fact and part legend. The same is true of Stirling Bridge itself. We know the broad outlines of what happened, the narrow bridge, the trapped army, the slaughter. But many details have been lost or embellished over the 7 centuries since the battle. The story has been told and retold, shaped by each generation to fit its own needs and values. The Wallace of medieval chronicles is different from the Wallace of Robert Burns's poetry, which is different from the Wallace of Braveheart, which is different from the Wallace of serious historical scholarship. And yet, through all these transformations, something essential remains. The core truth of Stirling Bridge, that a nation can rise against its oppressors, that courage can triumph over power, that freedom is worth dying for, continues to resonate. When Scottish football fans chant about Wallace before international matches, when tourists from around the world climb the Wallace Monument to look out over the battlefield, when historians debate the exact location of the bridge and the precise sequence of the fighting, they are all connecting with something that happened more than 700 years ago, but still matters today. The savagery of Stirling Bridge, the thousands dead, the river choked with bodies, the flayed skin of a tax collector was not incidental to its meaning. It was central. Violence on this scale was the price of freedom in the medieval world, and perhaps in any world where freedom must be won rather than given. Wallace understood this. His methods were brutal because the situation was brutal, because anything less than total commitment would have meant total defeat. The English did not leave Scotland because they were asked nicely. They left because the cost of staying became too high. This is the uncomfortable truth that the sanitized versions of history prefer to avoid. Liberation movements are rarely clean or pretty. They involve bloodshed, atrocity, and moral compromises that would be unacceptable in peacetime. The men who charged down Abbey Craig that day were not saints. They were killers, driven by rage and desperation to acts of extreme violence. But they were also heroes, in the sense that matters most. They risked everything for something larger than themselves, and they won. The River Forth still flows past Stirling, as it did on that September morning in 1297. The castle still stands on its rock, commanding the strategic crossing point that has made this spot important since Roman times. The hills where Wallace positioned his army still overlook the valley, and from their heights it is still possible to imagine the scene. The mist rising from the water, the English army crossing the narrow bridge, the waiting Scots, the sudden charge, the slaughter. History happened here and history remembers. 728 years later, the questions raised at Stirling Bridge remain relevant. When is violence justified in the pursuit of freedom? How do occupied peoples resist without becoming as brutal as their occupiers? What makes a leader worth following? Noble birth, military skill, moral authority, or simply the willingness to fight when others will not? Wallace's answers to these questions were written in blood on the banks of the River Forth, and we are still reading them today. The England that Wallace fought has long since transformed into something very different. The Scotland he fought to free is now part of a voluntary union, not a conquered province. The methods of warfare he employed, the close-order infantry formations, the 12-foot spears, the cavalry charges, have been obsolete for centuries. And yet Stirling Bridge matters, not as a guide to contemporary warfare or politics, but as a reminder of what human beings are capable of when pushed to extremes, both the heights of courage and the depths of brutality. When we consider the tactical brilliance of Stirling Bridge, we must appreciate the depth of Wallace's understanding of his enemy. He knew that the English commanders were arrogant, convinced of their superiority, certain that Scottish resistance was merely a temporary annoyance to be swatted away. He knew that they would underestimate him, that they would make mistakes born of contempt, and he knew exactly how to exploit those mistakes. The patience he displayed that morning, watching, waiting, counting as the English crossed, required extraordinary nerve. A lesser commander would have attacked too early or too late. Wallace waited until the trap was perfect, and then he sprang it. The role of Andrew Moray in the victory has often been overshadowed by Wallace's legendary status, but it should not be forgotten. Moray was the one who had raised the North, who had proven that resistance was possible before Wallace's rebellion in the South had even begun. He was the one with military training, with noble connections, with the resources to sustain a prolonged campaign. The partnership between Wallace and Moray, the commoner and the nobleman, the southerner and the northerner, the self-made warrior and the trained soldier, was greater than the sum of its parts. Scotland lost something irreplaceable when Moray died of his wounds after the battle. The fate of the English prisoners taken at Stirling Bridge is not well documented, but we can assume that most were either killed or held for ransom, depending on their social status. Common soldiers were generally worth nothing alive. The economics of medieval warfare made it impractical to feed and guard large numbers of prisoners who could not be ransomed. Knights and nobles, on the other hand, were valuable commodities, their freedom purchasable by their families for substantial sums. This mercenary aspect of medieval warfare strikes modern readers as distasteful, but it was an integral part of the military culture of the time. The political consequences of Stirling Bridge extended far beyond Scotland. News of the English defeat spread throughout Europe, reaching courts from Paris to Rome. For England's enemies, and Edward the I had many, it was welcome news indeed. The French king saw an opportunity to support Scottish resistance as a way of distracting his English rival. The Pope, always interested in opportunities to extend his influence, took note of Scotland's struggle. Wallace's diplomatic missions in the years after Stirling Bridge attempted to capitalize on this international interest with limited success. Within England, the defeat caused a crisis of confidence. Edward I's reputation as an invincible conqueror was tarnished. The nobles who had been promised Scottish lands and offices saw their investments evaporate. The common people, who bore the tax burden of Edward's endless wars, grumbled at yet another failed expedition. The political pressures that would eventually force Edward to confirm the Magna Carta and accept limits on his power were intensified by the Scottish disaster. Stirling Bridge was not just a Scottish victory, It was an English defeat, with all the consequences that entailed. The weapons and armor used at Stirling Bridge reflect the military technology of the late 13th century, a period of transition between the age of mail and the age of plate. The Scottish spearmen would have been lightly armored at best, perhaps a padded jacket, a simple helmet, and a wooden shield. Their primary weapon was the spear, 12 feet or more in length, designed to keep enemies at a distance rather than to kill them up close. This was a weapon of defense, of formation fighting, of disciplined ranks holding their ground against cavalry charges. The English knights, by contrast, were encased in the finest armor money could buy. Chain-mail hauberks covered their bodies from neck to knee, supplemented by plate protection on the limbs and joints. Their heads were protected by great helms or bassinets, their horses by caparisons of leather and mail. They carried lances for the initial charge, swords for close combat, and maces or war hammers for crushing armored opponents. This equipment was enormously expensive. A single knight's gear might cost as much as a small village produced in a year, and enormously effective against opponents who fought in the traditional manner. The problem for the English was that Wallace did not fight in the traditional manner. The Chiltern formation neutralized the cavalry charge that was the knight's primary tactic. The long spears outreached the knight's lance. The dense formation made it impossible to ride through or around. Faced with a wall of spear points, even the bravest horses refused to advance, and knights who fell from their mounts found themselves helpless on the ground, weighed down by their expensive armor, easy prey for Scottish daggers and clubs. This failure of cavalry against disciplined infantry would be repeated throughout the coming century. At Courtrai, in 1302, Flemish militia would slaughter French knights in a battle so bloody it was called the Battle of the Golden Spurs. At Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce would use Chiltern tactics similar to Wallace's to destroy another English army. At Morgarten in 1315 and Laupen in 1339, Swiss peasants would prove that armored cavalry was not invincible. The lesson of Stirling Bridge was that tactics and terrain could overcome equipment and training, a lesson that would reshape European warfare. The English longbowmen, who would prove so devastating at Falkirk, Crécy and Agincourt, were present at Stirling Bridge, but they were unable to influence the battle. The narrow bridge prevented them from deploying effectively, and the speed of the Scottish attack gave them no time to form their deadly volleys. This was another aspect of Wallace's tactical genius. By choosing the battlefield and the moment of attack, he neutralized the English weapons that might have defeated him. At Falkirk, on open ground, the longbows would have their revenge. The religious dimension of the conflict is often overlooked in modern accounts, but was central to how contemporaries understood it. Scotland and England were both Christian nations, both subject to papal authority, both participants in the great crusading enterprise. The Scottish Church had long insisted on its independence from English ecclesiastical control, and this religious nationalism was closely tied to political nationalism. Many Scottish bishops and abbots supported Wallace's rebellion, providing money, supplies, and moral legitimacy. The Abbey of Cambus Kenneth, near the battlefield, sheltered Scottish soldiers and probably cared for the wounded. The English, for their part, portrayed the Scottish rebels as savages and heretics, violators of the peace of Christ and disturbers of the divine order. Edward the Firn's propaganda emphasized the brutality of the Scots. The flaying of Cressingham, the raids into northern England, the killing of English settlers and administrators. This narrative was designed to justify harsh measures against the rebels and to maintain support for the costly campaigns in England. Both sides claimed God's favor. Both sides believed their cause was just, and both sides were prepared to kill in the name of their beliefs. The aftermath of Stirling Bridge saw a flourishing of Scottish national sentiment that found expression in literature, art, and political theory. The Declaration of Arbroath, written in 1320, articulated a vision of Scottish independence that drew on the memory of Wallace and the victory he had won. "For so long as 100 of us remain alive," the declaration proclaimed, "we will never in any way submit to the rule of the English." This was the spirit of Stirling Bridge, translated into constitutional language, the rage of the battlefield transformed into a principled statement of national identity. The physical hardships of medieval warfare are difficult for modern readers to appreciate. The soldiers who fought at Stirling Bridge had marched for days or weeks to reach the battlefield. They had slept rough, often without tents or shelter. They had eaten whatever they could find or carry: oatcakes, dried meat, foraged vegetables. They had suffered from diseases that spread rapidly in military camps: dysentery, typhus, various fevers. Many arrived at the battle already weakened, already sick, already at the limits of their endurance. And then they were expected to fight. For the English soldiers trapped in the loop of the river, the physical experience of the battle must have been horrific beyond description. The crush of bodies as the Scottish attack pressed them back, the screams of wounded men and dying horses, the mud churned to bloody paste by thousands of feet, the desperate struggle to stay upright, to keep fighting, to find some path of escape that did not exist. And finally, for many, the cold embrace of the River Forth, promising relief from the nightmare of the battlefield, but delivering only death. The survivors on both sides would have been marked by the experience for the rest of their lives. Medieval societies did not recognize what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, but the symptoms would have been familiar: nightmares, flashbacks, inability to function in peacetime, explosive violence triggered by reminders of the battle. Many veterans of Stirling Bridge would have drunk themselves into early graves, or retreated into religious contemplation, or simply been unable to readjust to normal life. The psychological cost of medieval warfare is an aspect of history that is rarely discussed, but was undoubtedly significant. For the widows and orphans created by the battle, the consequences were immediate and dire. Medieval society offered little support for women who lost their breadwinners. They might remarry if they were young and attractive, or fall back on family if they had family to fall back on, or simply starve. The children of men killed at Stirling Bridge grew up without fathers, without the training in trades or farming that fathers provided, without the social connections that fathers cultivated. A single battle could devastate communities for generations. The economic impact of Stirling Bridge rippled outward from the battlefield. The English had invested enormous resources in the conquest and occupation of Scotland, and now that investment was lost. The garrisons that fled south took what they could carry. Everything else fell into Scottish hands. The taxes that Cressingham had collected so ruthlessly would never reach English coffers again. The merchants who had followed the army, hoping to profit from the occupation, saw their ventures collapse. The Scottish economy, devastated by the conquest, began a slow recovery now that the English parasites had been expelled. Wallace's brief period as Guardian of Scotland saw attempts at reconstruction and normalization. He tried to restore trade connections with Europe, particularly with the Hanseatic League and the Low Countries. He attempted to establish regular government, to collect taxes for Scottish rather than English purposes, to rebuild the military capacity that would be needed for future conflicts. But his time was too short, his resources too limited, and the English counterattack too swift. Falkirk came less than a year after Stirling Bridge, and everything Wallace had built came crashing down. The question of what might have been, if Wallace had won at Falkirk, if he had maintained his position as Guardian, if he had lived to see Scotland through to independence, is one of history's great counterfactuals. Would Scotland have become independent decades earlier? Would the long and bloody wars of independence have been shorter and less destructive? Would Wallace have proved as effective a peacetime administrator as he was a wartime commander? We cannot know. What we know is what happened. Falkirk, flight, capture, execution, and the transformation of a living warrior into a deathless symbol. The execution of Wallace was designed to end the Scottish resistance once and for all. It had the opposite effect. By turning Wallace into a martyr, Edward I ensured that his name would live forever, that his example would inspire generations of Scots to continue the fight. Robert the Bruce, watching from the shadows, learned from Wallace's fate, learned that negotiation with Edward was impossible, that half measures would lead to the scaffold, that only total commitment to independence could succeed. Bruce's eventual triumph at Bannockburn was built on the foundation that Wallace had laid. The legacy of Stirling Bridge in Scottish national consciousness cannot be overstated. For 7 centuries, the battle has served as proof that Scotland can stand against any enemy, that Scottish arms can triumph against any odds, that Scottish courage is the equal of any in the world. This is not mere sentiment. It is a core element of Scottish identity, reinforced by literature, education, and popular culture. The annual commemorations at Stirling, the Wallace Monument dominating the skyline, the countless songs and poems and stories, all of these keep the memory of that September morning alive. The international influence of Wallace and Stirling Bridge has extended far beyond Scotland. The American Revolution drew explicit parallels between the Scottish struggle for independence and the American cause. Patrick Henry's famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death," echoes the spirit of Wallace's resistance. The imagery of a small nation rising against a great empire, of citizen soldiers defeating professional armies, of freedom as a cause worth dying for. This imagery has been deployed in countless liberation movements, from Ireland to India to Vietnam. The historical accuracy of these parallels can be debated, but their emotional power is undeniable. Wallace has become a universal symbol of resistance to oppression, transcending his specific historical context to represent something larger: the human refusal to be enslaved, the willingness to fight for dignity and freedom, the capacity of the few to stand against the many. This transformation from historical figure to universal symbol has distorted our understanding of the real Wallace, but it has also ensured that his story continues to be told. The relationship between Wallace the man and Wallace the legend is complex and often contradictory. The historical Wallace was a violent guerrilla leader who killed English soldiers and administrators, burned English-held castles, and flayed his enemies. The legendary Wallace is a noble freedom fighter who never committed an unjust act and died for his principles. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, in the recognition that real people are more complicated than legends allow, that heroism and brutality can coexist in the same individual, that history is messier than the stories we tell about it. Modern scholarship has done much to separate the historical Wallace from the legendary one, but the legend persists because it serves a purpose that historical accuracy cannot fulfill. People need heroes, need stories of courage and sacrifice, need to believe that resistance to oppression can succeed. The legend of Wallace provides all of this, and it does so in a form that is memorable, moving, and emotionally satisfying. The historical Wallace, with all his ambiguities and moral complexities, is harder to embrace, but he is also more human, more real, more relevant to the complicated world we actually live in. The debate over Wallace's legacy continues to this day. Scottish nationalists claim him as a founding father of Scottish identity, proof that Scotland has always been a distinct nation with a right to self-determination. Unionists counter that Wallace's Scotland was a very different place from modern Scotland, that the issues of the 13th century are not the issues of the 21st, that the past cannot dictate the present. Both sides have legitimate points, and the argument is unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. What is beyond dispute is that Stirling Bridge changed history. Before September 11, 1297, English conquest of Scotland seemed complete and permanent. After that day, it was clear that Scotland would never be easily ruled, that its people would never simply accept foreign domination, that the cost of occupation would always exceed the benefits. This realization would shape English policy towards Scotland for centuries, leading eventually to the Union of the Crowns in 1603 and the Parliamentary Union in 1707, a union negotiated between equals, not imposed by conquest. The morning of September 11th, 1297 began like any other. The sun rose over the Ochil Hills, burning off the mist from the River Forth. Birds sang in the trees around Abbey Craig. In the English camp, south of the river, soldiers prepared for another day of campaigning, eating their breakfast, checking their weapons, waiting for orders. In the Scottish lines on the hill above, other soldiers did the same, but with a tension and anticipation that their English counterparts did not share. They knew what was coming. They had been preparing for this moment for months. By noon, thousands of men were dead. The loop of the river had become an abattoir. The waters of the Forth stained red with blood. An English army had been destroyed. An English treasurer had been skinned. And a Scottish commoner had become the most famous man in Britain. The world had changed, and it would never change back. William Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge was far more savage than history books tell, and far more important. It was the day Scotland found its voice, and that voice was a battle cry that echoes still. As we reflect on the events of that distant September day, we must acknowledge both the horror and the heroism of what occurred. The savagery of Stirling Bridge, the slaughter of thousands, the mutilation of bodies, the cruelty visited upon the defeated cannot be excused or explained away. These were terrible acts, born of terrible circumstances, perpetrated by men who had themselves been victims of terrible oppression. War brings out the worst in humanity, even when the cause is just. But the heroism cannot be denied either. The men who followed Wallace and Moray down Abbey Craig knew they were facing the most powerful army in Europe. They knew the odds were against them, knew that defeat meant death or enslavement, knew that even victory might be Pyrrhic. They charged anyway. They risked everything, their lives, their families, their futures, for something larger than themselves. Whatever we think of their methods, we cannot question their courage. The story of Stirling Bridge reminds us that history is not inevitable, that the decisions of individuals matter, that courage and cunning can change the course of nations. Edward the Fan was the mightiest king in Europe, with resources that the Scots could never match, but he was not unbeatable. Wallace proved that, and in proving it, he gave Scotland something priceless, the belief that independence was possible, that freedom could be won, that the English were not invincible gods, but mortal men who could be defeated. 7 centuries later, the bridge is gone, the combatants are dust, and the nation they fought for has taken forms that Wallace could never have imagined. But the questions raised at Stirling Bridge remain as urgent as ever. What do we owe to our nations, our communities, our fellow human beings? When is violence justified, and when does it become self-defeating? How do we remember the past without being enslaved by it? How do we honor the dead without glorifying the killing? Wallace himself might have had simple answers to these questions. He was, after all, a man of action rather than philosophy. But his life and death posed the questions nonetheless, challenging each generation to find its own answers. The blood spilled at Stirling Bridge has long since washed away, but the legacy remains, a reminder that freedom is never free, that tyranny can be resisted, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the cause is great enough. The River Forth flows on, as it has for millennia before Stirling Bridge and will for millennia after. The castle still stands on its rock, watching over the strategic crossing that has shaped Scottish history since time immemorial. And somewhere in that landscape, in the soil and the water and the air, the memory of September 11, 1297 persists. A memory of courage and cruelty, of victory and vengeance, of a day when history turned on a narrow wooden bridge and the savage heart of Scottish resistance beat louder than it ever had before. This is the true story of Stirling Bridge. It is not comfortable. It is not clean. It is not the simplified narrative of heroes and villains that makes for easy consumption. But it is real, and it matters. And it deserves to be told in all its savage, complicated, profoundly human truth. William Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge was far more savage than history books tell, and that savagery was the price of freedom. Whether that price was worth paying is a question that every generation must answer for itself.